The Australian service dress tunic of 1914 has a long history because it evolved. And it evolved really almost as a nationalistic statement. If you'd looked at the Australian colonial units in the late 19th century, you could have swapped them for any British infantry unit. They were wearing red tunics if they were army, or if blue tunics if they were cavalry or artillery, white cork helmets. They really did look like British troops on foreign deployment. By the end of the century, the British Army was realising that red and blue serge uniforms were A, inappropriate for service in tropical climates, and B, making a target of themselves as the weapons of the enemy became much more sophisticated. And so they adopted a uniform that had been worn by the British Army in India, khaki cotton. Khaki is the Persian or Urdu word for dusty, and so they wore a dull khaki uniform for campaign. And of course the Australians went to the Sudan in 1885. The colony of New South Wales sent an infantry battalion, a battery of artillery and a field ambulance. And then each of the Australian colonies sent contingents to the South African War. And they wore a colonial version of that khaki uniform, that cotton khaki uniform that the British had been wearing. By the end of the South African War, the British adopted a woolen uniform. They were preparing for a war in Europe. But they made two uniforms. One was for their troops for the European War, and the other was for their troops on tropical service. The Australians saw that uniform that the British had introduced around about 1902 and made their own version. It was called the Commonwealth Pattern Uniform. Introduced with the Australian Defence Act of 1903, and it was made of khaki cotton. But as war loomed in Europe, the Australian Defence Department started to think about a woolen uniform for Australians, and by 1914 they had developed what they called the Jackets Service Dress, and they were introducing it just as the Great War broke out. And so that's why the Australian service dress of 1914 soon became known as the AIF jacket, because it was the uniform that equipped our soldiers of the Australian Imperial Force that went off to the Great War of 1914-1918.